The Genius of Livia Drusilla. Part 1. In the popular imagination, she's the woman who poisoned Rome, an empress of whisper and shadow, the villain of countless plays, novels, and television dramas. From Robert Graves's I, Claudius, to the latest prestige television series, the story remains the same. Livia Drusilla, the calculating murderess who cleared a path to power over the bodies of Rome's finest sons. History seems to love a dangerous woman, especially one who dares to win. They called her ruthless, manipulative, a schemer in pearls. Ancient historians wrote of her with a mixture of fascination and fear, their quills dripping with accusations they could never quite prove. Tacitus, writing a century after her death, painted her as a woman of old-fashioned inflexibility and excessive motherly devotion, which in Roman terms was code for something far more sinister. Cassius Dio described her as possessing all the virtues of women, while simultaneously wielding power over the most powerful man in the world. Even in praise there was poison. Yet behind the legend of the poisoner stands another story, one written not in fear but in brilliance. This is not the face of a monster. This is power concealed in virtue. This is a woman who understood something that would take the world 2,000 years to articulate. That perception is reality, that image is infrastructure, and that the most effective revolutions happen so quietly that no one realizes they're living through one until it's already complete. Before she became the matron saint of Roman stability, before her face adorned coins and temples, before she was deified as the divine mother of an empire, Livia Drusilla was prey in the chaos of civil war. The year was 42 BCE. The old republic, that ancient system of checks and balances, of consuls and tribunes, of senators who once represented the voice of Rome, was collapsing into blood-soaked rubble. It had been dying for decades, murdered slowly by its own success, by territories too vast to govern fairly, by wealth too concentrated to distribute justly, by ambitions too large to contain within the framework of shared power. Armies clashed across Italy, and families fled in terror as Caesar's assassins fought for their lives against the coalition of the Second Triumvirate. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus had divided the world between them and were systematically destroying anyone who had raised a hand against the divine Julius. The prescriptions, those death lists that turned neighbor against neighbor, that made fortunes from confiscated estates, that taught Romans to fear the knock on the door at midnight, claimed thousands of lives. Among the refugees was a young woman named Livia, barely 20 years old, carrying her infant son, Tiberius, in her arms. Her husband, Tiberius Claudius Nero, was fleeing for his life. Her family had chosen the wrong side. They had supported the liberators, the assassins who killed Caesar in the name of the Republic. Now they were hunted by the most dangerous man in Rome, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's heir, the cold-eyed 18-year-old who signed death warrants with the casual efficiency of a bureaucrat, and who would later remake himself as Augustus, the Sacred One, the father of his country. Picture this moment. A patrician woman born into one of Rome's oldest families, the Claudii, a bloodline that stretched back to the city's earliest days, now running through the countryside like a common criminal. She clutches her infant son while her husband desperately seeks allies among Rome's enemies. They flee first to Sicily, to the remnants of Republican resistance. When that fails, they cross to Greece, to Mark Antony, begging for protection from Octavian's vengeance. A toddler experiencing his first years in exile camps and borrowed villas, learning the geography of fear before he learned his letters. She should have disappeared into history that day, another footnote in the civil wars that devoured the Republic. Another widow, another casualty, another woman whose name would be forgotten as Rome moved on to its next crisis. But she didn't. Somehow, in the wreckage of destroyed families and defeated legions, in the years of uncertainty and displacement, Livia re-emerged not broken, but sharper. She survived the fall of her world by studying the men who caused it. What did she learn in those years of exile? What lessons did a young woman absorb as she watched the Republic's final death throes? She learned that ideology was a luxury, that survival required pragmatism, that the men who won were not the most honorable, but the most adaptable. She watched as her husband clung to Republican principles, even as the Republic became a corpse, and she understood that nostalgia was not a strategy. She observed how Octavian transformed from butcher to statesman, from conspirator to savior, through nothing more complicated than winning and waiting, letting time soften the edges of his crimes until people forgot they were crimes at all. When the wars ended and the triumvirate collapsed into Octavian's sole rule, when the proscription stopped and the death lists were burned, when Augustus stood victorious and declared that peace had returned to Rome, Livia came home. She returned to the city that had once hunted her, that had confiscated her family's property, that had branded her household as enemies of the state. And within a few years, she became its most indispensable woman. How? The question echoes across 2 millennia. How does a woman, legally classified as property, forbidden from political participation, barred from military command, excluded from the Senate and the assemblies and every formal mechanism of Roman power, how does she become the most influential person in the known world? Livia didn't merely survive the storm. She learned to read it, to navigate its winds, to predict its patterns. In a society where women could not vote, hold office, or command armies, she reinvented power itself. She understood that in the new Rome, the Rome exhausted by war, desperate for stability, willing to trade freedom for peace, there was space for a new kind of influence. Not the power of office, but the power of image. Not the authority of law, but the authority of virtue. Morality became her language, modesty her armor, and patience her sharpest weapon. She would teach a nation exhausted by war to mistake her quiet influence for virtue, her strategic brilliance for wifely devotion, her political genius for maternal concern. She would make herself indispensable by making herself invisible, powerful by appearing powerless, essential by seeming traditional. Livia Drusilla didn't just shape the Roman Empire, she built its image, the mythology of Augustan peace, the fantasy of restored republic, the illusion that Rome had returned to the virtues of its ancestors, even as it surrendered to autocracy. And she did it without ever holding a single official title, without ever commanding a legion or proposing a law or standing in the forum to address the people. She engineered the survival of her house and the myth of peace itself through methods so subtle that even now, 2,000 years later, historians argue about what she actually did versus what she was accused of doing. The men of her time built monuments, triumphal arches, massive temples, forums that bore their names. Augustus's building program transformed Rome from brick to marble, as he boasted, creating a city that reflected imperial grandeur. But monuments crumble, marble cracks, inscriptions fade. Livia built something more enduring. Legacies. She built the concept of the imperial family itself, the idea that Rome could be inherited like property, passed from generation to generation, that one bloodline could embody the state. So, how did a woman stripped of every legal right become the most powerful person in the Roman world? How did someone with no vote, no property rights, no legal standing beyond her relationship to male relatives, how did she architect an empire's ideology? It began, as all revolutions do, with image, with understanding that power in the new Rome would belong not to those who commanded legions, but to those who controlled the story Rome told about itself. Part 2. The Architect of Image. The scandal began with a wedding. Rome loves a wedding, and Rome especially loves a scandalous wedding. The kind that sets tongues wagging in the bathhouses, that becomes the subject of graffiti on tavern walls, that poets reference with knowing winks. But this particular scandal in 38 BCE would reshape the empire. Livia was already married to Tiberius Claudius Nero, a respected noble from the same ancient patrician family as herself. They had produced a son, young Tiberius, and she was pregnant with their second child. By all accounts, it was a stable marriage between two aristocrats of appropriate rank, exactly the kind of alliance that Roman society expected and approved. Augustus, too, had a wife, Scribonia, who had recently given birth to his only biological child, his daughter Julia. Yet history tells us that when Octavian and Livia met at a dinner party, according to tradition, though the exact circumstances are lost to time, the attraction was instantaneous, a union as politically calculated as it was passionate. The sources disagree on the nature of their initial connection. Some claim it was love at first sight, an overwhelming passion that neither could resist. Others suggest it was entirely pragmatic, that Octavian needed to marry into the ancient Claudian family to legitimize his relatively humble origins, and that Livia saw an opportunity to secure her family's future by aligning with Rome's rising master. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that's what made it so effective. Within months, both spouses were divorced. Scribonia gave birth to Julia and was dismissed the same day, a calculated cruelty designed to show that Augustus valued Livia more than his newborn daughter's mother. Tiberius Claudius Nero agreed to the divorce with suspicious speed, perhaps understanding that refusing the master of Rome was not a viable option, perhaps compensated with political favors we can no longer trace. And Livia, 6 months pregnant with her second son, Drusus, married the most powerful man in the world. The religious authorities had to grant special dispensation. Roman custom and law required a waiting period after divorce to ensure paternity clarity. The priests had to examine the marriage for signs of legitimacy, to declare that the gods approved this union despite its violation of every traditional norm. That they did so tells us everything about how power worked in the new Rome. When the master wants something, the gods find a way to approve. To traditional Romans, it was a scandal of cosmic proportions. A pregnant bride, still wearing the swollen belly of another man's child, marrying in haste without proper observance of the sacred waiting period, a hasty union that violated every convention of modesty and propriety. The timing alone was suspicious, divorcing and remarrying within weeks rather than months, as if unable to wait, as if driven by ungovernable passion or ruthless ambition or both. The whispers started immediately. Was this divine intervention or human conspiracy? Was Augustus following his heart or securing a political alliance? Was Livia a victim of circumstances or an ambitious climber who saw her chance and seized it? The rumors ranged from the romantic to the salacious, that they had been conducting an affair for months, that Tiberius Claudius Nero was merely a temporary husband until Augustus was available, that the child she carried might not be Nero's after all, that the marriage was a statement of contempt for traditional morality. But while other women might have hidden in shame, while other brides might have retreated from public view until the scandal faded, while any sensible woman would have avoided attention until Rome found something new to gossip about, Livia did the opposite. She leaned into the role of the virtuous matron with an audacity that still astonishes. She understood something that modern political consultants would take 2,000 years to articulate. You cannot defeat a scandal by hiding from it. You can only transform it. You cannot make people forget the story they've heard. You can only give them a better story. Where her enemies expected Cleopatra's theatrical glamour, the golden barges, the pearl dissolved in wine, the Egyptian mystique that had seduced both Caesar and Mark Antony, Livia adopted radical simplicity. She dressed in homespun wool, the kind of fabric that Roman farmers' wives wore, not the imported silks and dyed linens that wealthy women favored. She adopted the nodus, a simple hairstyle where the hair was tied in a plain knot above the forehead, without elaborate curls or jewelry or the complex arrangements that required teams of slave hairdressers. That hairstyle became a national fashion statement. Within years, women across Italy were copying Livia's nodus, not because it was glamorous, but because it represented something deeper. A declaration that she, unlike the Egyptian queen before her, unlike the corrupt aristocrats of the dying republic, was the ideal Roman wife. Traditional, modest, virtuous. The kind of woman that Rome's ancestors would have recognized and approved. She appeared at religious ceremonies in public, performing the traditional sacrifices with her own hands rather than delegating to priestesses. She visited temples regularly, making offerings to the old gods, demonstrating piety at a time when Augustus was trying to restore religious observance after decades of neglect. She sponsored the restoration of sacred sites, funded festivals, participated in rituals that most aristocratic women found tedious. She presented herself as a living connection to Rome's imagined past, to the legendary women of the early Republic, figures like Lucretia, whose virtue was so pure that she preferred death to dishonor, like Cornelia, who raised the Gracchi brothers and declared her children were her only jewels, like the nameless wives of farmers and soldiers who spun wool and raised children and asked nothing more from life than to serve family and state. In a single stroke, she converted scandal into symbolism. The pregnant bride became the devoted wife. The hasty marriage became a love match blessed by fate and sanctioned by the gods. The shocking union became a metaphor that Augustus's propaganda machine could use. Augustus, the restorer of order, joined with Livia, the emblem of morality. Together, they embodied a new age of peace after decades of chaos, a return to virtue after generations of corruption, a restoration of the old ways through their partnership. It was genius-level rebranding. It was spin before the concept of spin existed. It was image management at a sophistication that would not be matched until the age of modern media. But it required more than costume changes and hairstyles. It required Livia to live the role completely, to make the image so consistent and pervasive that it became reality in the minds of Romans. While Augustus built laws, his famous moral legislation that punished adultery, encouraged marriage, rewarded childbearing, attempted to legislate virtue back into Roman society, Livia built the facade of morality that made those laws credible. She refused luxury when flaunting wealth was fashionable among the Roman elite, while other aristocratic women competed to display their husbands' wealth through jewelry, exotic foods, rare perfumes, and elaborate entertainment. Livia maintained studied simplicity. Her household was run with efficiency rather than opulence. She ate modestly, dressed modestly, appeared in public without the retinue of attendants that most women of her status considered essential. She famously spun her own wool. This detail appears in multiple sources, always with a tone of wonder, as if the wife of the master of the world engaging in manual labor was something remarkable, which it was. Wool spinning was symbolic in Roman culture, the quintessential feminine virtue, the occupation of the good wife. Legendary women of Rome's past were praised for their wool-working. For Livia to personally spin and weave, to produce the fabric for Augustus's togas with her own hands, was a statement that she embodied those ancient values. Was it true? Did she actually spend hours at the loom, or was it performance art, a few public moments of spinning while slaves did the real work? It doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it, that the image became the reality in the collective imagination of Rome. She performed sacrifices with her own hands, without delegating to priestesses or slaves. She participated in women's religious festivals, the secretive rites closed to men, maintaining the traditions that connected Roman women to the divine. She restored temples that had fallen into disrepair during the civil wars, using her own wealth, or rather using Augustus's wealth in her name, to fund the maintenance of sacred spaces. For Romans weary of corruption, exhausted by decades of civil war, desperate for stability and normalcy, she was the vision of ancient virtue reborn. Her household became a living sermon about the simplicity and discipline of old Rome, a constant reminder that the chaos of the recent past could be replaced by the order of an imagined earlier age. But beneath that wool and modesty was calculation of the highest order. By seeming traditional, by appearing to embody everything a Roman matron should be, she earned entry into the spaces where no woman should have held influence. The council chambers where policy was debated, the private letters where decisions were made, the imperial mind of Augustus himself where she could whisper advice that would become law. She made herself indispensable not through formal power, but through moral authority. Augustus needed her image to legitimize his rule. He had come to power through violence and proscriptions, through civil war and the destruction of the Republic. His hands were stained with the blood of thousands. But standing beside Livia, the virtuous wife, the traditional matron, the embodiment of old Roman values. He could claim to be restoring what he had actually destroyed. She understood the fundamental bargain of the new imperial system. Romans would accept autocracy if it was wrapped in republican language, would surrender freedom if it was called restoration, would tolerate dictatorship if the dictator's wife spun wool and dressed simply. The image of virtue mattered more than virtue itself. The performance of tradition mattered more than actual tradition. She hid her power in plain sight, made it invisible by making it seem natural, disguised influence as wifely devotion, and in doing so she became irreplaceable. Not because Augustus couldn't rule without her, but because his entire project of legitimization depended on the image they presented together. She was the proof that his regime was moral, traditional, blessed by the gods and approved by history. The scandalous wedding was forgotten. The pregnant bride disappeared from memory. In their place stood Augusta and Augustus, the first family of Rome, the living embodiment of the peace they promised. And Livia had architected that transformation through nothing more than image control, through understanding that in politics, perception shapes reality rather than the other way around. It was a lesson she would apply again and again, refining her methods, expanding her influence, building an invisible empire of loyalty and obligation that would outlast Augustus himself. Part 3. The Counselor, Power Behind the Curtain. Livia's genius was subtle, operating in the shadows where formal power could not reach. She never needed to command because commands could be refused, could be debated, could be overruled. Instead, she advised. She whispered in the ear of the emperor and, through him, shaped the empire itself. This was power of the most sophisticated kind. Influence without fingerprints, impact without attribution. The ability to change policy while remaining invisible to public scrutiny. One story reveals this best, preserved by the Roman historian Seneca and repeated by others because it captured something essential about Livia's method. It concerns the conspiracy of young Cornelius Cinna. Augustus discovered that Cinna, a nobleman with impeccable credentials but questionable judgment, was plotting against him. The details of the conspiracy were unclear, perhaps assassination, perhaps merely treasonous talk that had been overheard and reported. What mattered was that Augustus had evidence, or believed he had evidence, that a member of the aristocracy was planning his death. The emperor's initial response was fury. Understandable fury, perhaps. He had survived countless assassination attempts, had lived through the murder of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, had seen what happened to leaders who showed mercy to conspirators. He was humiliated that despite all his efforts at reconciliation, despite his attempts to integrate former enemies into the new system, someone was still plotting to kill him. His instinct was execution, swift and public, a reminder that conspiracy against the emperor meant death. Livia intervened. She came to Augustus not with demands but with questions, employing the Socratic method before Socrates' dialogues were widely read in Rome. How many conspirators had he executed already? How many death sentences had he signed? Had those executions made him safer, or had they simply created more enemies, more families nursing grudges, more young men dreaming of vengeance? The cycle of retaliation, she pointed out, had no natural end. Every execution created martyrs. Every death spawned new conspiracies. She persuaded him to try something unprecedented, to pardon the young traitor, to summon Cinna and confront him with the evidence, to offer mercy instead of justice, not out of weakness, but as a strategic choice. She argued that mercy would strengthen his rule more than vengeance ever could, that transforming an enemy into an ally was worth more than making an example of a corpse. The argument went deeper than simple pragmatism. Livia understood that Augustus was trying to transform his image from military strongman to legitimate ruler, from the butcher who won the civil wars to the father of his country. A father punishes, yes, but he also forgives. A king executes threats, but an emperor can afford mercy. The more secure his rule appeared, the more secure it would actually become. Paranoia and violence were signs of weakness. Magnanimity was a show of strength. Augustus was skeptical. He had built his power on ruthlessness, on the willingness to do what needed to be done regardless of conscience. But Livia persisted, and eventually he agreed to try her approach. Perhaps because he trusted her judgment, perhaps because he was curious about the result, perhaps because after decades of violence he was weary of bloodshed. He summoned Cinna to a private meeting, without guards, without ceremony, without the theatrical trappings of imperial power, and he confronted the young man with the evidence of his treason, laid out the conspiracy in detail, proved that he knew everything. Then, instead of pronouncing sentence, he asked why. Why betray a regime that had shown you favor? Why plot murder when you could have a future in the new Rome? Cinna, expecting death, was speechless. And in that silence, Augustus offered forgiveness. Complete forgiveness. Not merely sparing his life, but restoring his honors, promising advancement, treating him not as a failed conspirator, but as a wayward son who had lost his way and could now return to the family. The empire gasped. It was unprecedented. It was inexplicable by the logic of Roman politics, where mercy was weakness and forgiveness invited further treachery. But it worked. Cinna became one of Augustus's most loyal supporters, serving him faithfully for the rest of his life, eventually rising to high office. And the story spread throughout the empire, repeated in letters and histories, transformed into an exemplum of Augustan virtue. That single act transformed Augustus's public image. From a ruthless warlord who had proscribed thousands, who had divorced his wife on the day she gave birth, who had seized power through violence and maintained it through fear, he became a patient statesman, a merciful ruler, the embodied father of his country who could forgive even conspiracy. The man who killed his enemies became the man who converted enemies into friends. Yet it wasn't his idea. The strategy, the argument, the entire framework came from Livia. She had taught him how to look divine, how to perform magnanimity, how to convert justice into theater. And because the advice came privately, because it was given in the intimate space of their marriage rather than in public council, Augustus could claim the credit while Livia remained invisible. This was her method, to shape policy while remaining unattributable, to influence outcomes while leaving no evidence of her involvement. She operated through suggestion rather than command, through persuasion rather than force, through the intimate authority of the marriage bed and the private council rather than the public forum, where her gender would have disqualified her from participation. But she didn't stop at the emperor. That would have been too limiting, too dependent on one man's continued favor and life. Over the years, systematically and patiently, Livia built an independent network of influence that extended throughout the empire. She created an informal system of patronage that operated parallel to Augustus's formal structures of power. She sponsored architects, funding building projects throughout Italy and the provinces, ensuring that her name appeared on dedications and her image appeared in statues. When locals wanted to honor the imperial family, they often built temples to Augustus and Livia together, acknowledging that power was shared even if the law said otherwise. She patronized poets, ensuring that literary works praised her virtues alongside Augustus's victories. Ovid, Horace, and others wrote verses celebrating her modesty, her beauty, her devotion. When those poets fell from favor, as Ovid famously did, exiled for reasons that remain mysterious, Livia's intervention could mean the difference between permanent banishment and eventual recall. She supported orphans, creating a system of aid for children who had lost their fathers in the civil wars. This wasn't mere charity, it was investment. Those children, raised with Livia's support, would remember their benefactor when they came of age. They would staff the administrative machinery of empire, serve in the legions, manage provinces, and they would owe their opportunities to the emperor's wife. She paid dowries so poor brides could marry, enabling unions that would otherwise have been impossible. Each dowry was a favor owed, a family obligated, a link in the chain of loyalty that bound Romans to the imperial household. When those marriages produced children, when those families prospered, they remembered who had made their happiness possible. She restored temples quietly, funding the reconstruction of sacred sites throughout Italy without demanding public recognition. But the priests remembered. When religious questions arose, when the gods needed to be consulted about policy, when sacral authority needed to be invoked, those priests remembered who had maintained their temples and funded their festivals. The note of gratitude from a provincial governor, preserved by chance in the historical record, thanking her for her intervention in a local dispute. The statue in a provincial city, erected by grateful citizens who credited her with securing Augustus's favor for their petition. The letter pleading for her intercession from a soldier facing court-martial, believing that the emperor's wife could save him when official channels had failed. Each was a brick in the invisible edifice of her power, a connection in the network that made her indispensable to the functioning of empire. Foreign ambassadors sent gifts not only to Augustus, but to Livia as well, a subtle acknowledgement that real power was shared, even if the law refused to admit it. When kings and queens wanted favorable treatment from Rome, they cultivated both emperor and empress, understanding that access to one often required the favor of the other. She received petitions directly, reading requests and complaints that would normally go only to the emperor. She corresponded with governors, offering advice on administrative matters that were technically outside her purview. She interceded in legal cases, suggesting mercy where the law demanded harshness, recommending appointments that would benefit her network of clients and allies. She became the unofficial minister of compassion, dispensing mercy and opportunity where she saw value. And because Romans believed she embodied virtue, because her public image was so carefully maintained, Her interventions carried moral authority that formal power could not match. When Livia asked for mercy, it wasn't corruption. It was the action of a good woman tempering justice with humanity. When she recommended an appointment, it wasn't nepotism. It was a virtuous matron recognizing merit. The same actions that would have appeared corrupt coming from a male official seemed praiseworthy coming from her. This network of obligation and loyalty operated outside the formal structures of Roman power, invisible to historians because it generated no official documents, left no legal trail, existed only in private letters and personal connections. But it was real, and it was powerful. More powerful, perhaps, than many official appointments, because loyalty to Livia lasted longer than loyalty to any man in Rome. Her clients and allies were everywhere, in the Senate where she couldn't sit, but could influence through those who owed her favors. In the provinces, where governors who wanted advancement knew to maintain good relations with the emperor's wife. In the military, where officers remembered that their careers had been aided by her intercession. In the priesthoods, in the bureaucracy, in the aristocratic families whose daughters she had helped marry well. She created a shadow government of influence and obligation, a parallel structure of power that operated alongside and sometimes superseded the formal institutions of the state. And she did it so subtly, with such careful attention to propriety and image, that even those who resented her influence couldn't quite articulate what she was doing or how she was doing it. This was power at its most sophisticated, influence without formal authority, impact without official position, the ability to shape outcomes while remaining technically powerless. Livia had discovered, or perhaps invented, a new form of political operation perfectly suited to her constrained circumstances. Denied official power by her gender, she built unofficial power through networks of loyalty. Excluded from formal decision-making, she shaped decisions through private counsel. Barred from commanding, she achieved through persuading. And the most remarkable aspect of her network was its durability. Augustus would die, emperors would change, dynasties would fall. But the network Livia built would persist because it was based not on temporary political alliances, but on genuine obligation, on favors given and remembered, on a careful cultivation of loyalty that transcended any individual ruler's reign. She became indispensable not because she held power, but because she was power, the living embodiment of the imperial system's informal operations, the necessary counterpart to Augustus's formal authority, the shadow that gave substance to the light. Part 4. The Dynastic Struggle. For all her subtlety, for all her carefully cultivated image and sophisticated networks of influence, Livia's greatest battle was fought not against external enemies, but against fate itself. The cruel mathematics of succession, the question that would haunt the Roman Empire for centuries. Who comes next? Augustus had no surviving sons. This was the fundamental problem that shaped the last decades of his reign and consumed Livia's energies. In a system where power theoretically could not be inherited, where the fiction of republican restoration required that each leader be chosen rather than born, yet where everyone understood that keeping power within the family was essential for stability. The lack of a direct male heir was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. The imperial family bloomed with heirs from other branches. Augustus's daughter, Julia, born to Scribonia, was the emperor's only biological child. Through Julia, the Julian bloodline could continue, but Julia herself could not rule in a society that granted women no formal political rights. Her value lay in her womb, in her ability to produce grandsons for Augustus, potential heirs who would carry Julian blood and could be groomed for power. Julia's sons, Gaius and Lucius, became Augustus's adopted heirs, raised in the imperial palace, trained in military and political arts, celebrated throughout the empire as the future of Rome. They were charming, capable young men who seemed destined for greatness. Beyond them stood a web of grandchildren and adoptive sons, cousins and nephews, a family tree whose every branch carried the potential for succession. And all of them stood before Livia's own child, Tiberius. Tiberius was older than Gaius and Lucius, more experienced, more capable by any objective measure. He was a successful military commander, a competent administrator, a man of proven ability. But he wasn't Julian by blood. He was Claudian from Livia's previous marriage, carrying the bloodline of his father, Tiberius Claudius Nero, rather than the divine Julius Caesar. In the brutal logic of dynastic succession, this made him secondary, a backup heir at best, someone who would inherit only if everyone else failed. One by one, fortune, or something like it, removed them. Marcellus died young. Augustus's nephew, married to Julia, groomed as a potential heir, struck down by illness in his early 20s. The timing was suspicious to those inclined toward conspiracy theories, but illness was common in ancient Rome, and young men died without assistance from poisoners. Still, the whispers began. Agrippa, Augustus's oldest friend and greatest general, was next married to Julia, though he was decades older than her. They produced Gaius and Lucius, the golden grandsons, and Agrippa seemed secure in his position as Augustus's closest advisor and potential regent if anything happened to the emperor. Then Agrippa died, relatively young, worn out by campaigns and the burdens of empire. Again, illness and age could explain it. But the whispers grew louder. Gaius Caesar died abroad in Lycia from an infected wound suffered in Armenia. He was 23, had been designated Augustus's heir, and was leading military campaigns to prove his worthiness. The wound itself was battle-related, the infection was natural. But to suspicious minds, poison could have been applied to a wound, could have turned a minor injury into a fatal illness. Lucius Caesar died in Massilia, modern Marseille, struck by sudden illness at age 19. He too had been designated as heir, was traveling on official business, was being groomed to share power with his brother. Another young man, another sudden death, another convenient removal of an obstacle to Tiberius's succession. Others were exiled rather than killed. Julia herself, Augustus's only daughter, was banished for adultery, or what Augustus called adultery, though the charges may have been political, a pretext to remove a woman whose independent sexual behavior threatened the emperor's moral legislation. Her daughter, the younger Julia, was also exiled on similar charges years later. Agrippa Posthumus, the youngest of Julia's sons, was declared insane and imprisoned on an island, eventually executed shortly after Augustus's death. The pattern seemed clear to ancient historians, and it seems clear to many modern ones. Someone was systematically eliminating the obstacles between Tiberius and power. The primary suspect then and now was Livia. The poisoner legend was born in these deaths, in these convenient removals, in the statistical improbability that so many healthy young men would die at precisely the moments when their deaths most benefited Tiberius. Tacitus, writing decades later, repeated the rumors with a careful ambiguity that neither confirmed nor denied. Whether by chance or the treachery of their stepmother Livia, I cannot say. That studied neutrality was itself damning. By raising the question, he encouraged readers to believe the answer was yes. Other historians were less careful, asserting directly that Livia poisoned figs on a tree that Augustus liked to pick from himself, or slipped toxins into wine at family dinners, or corrupted physicians to administer deadly medicines under the guise of treatment. But history offers no proof. No contemporary sources record evidence of poisoning. No trials were held, no accusations made while Livia lived. The charges appear only in histories written long after the events, by men who had never met Livia, who were repeating gossip and rumor elevated to historical fact through repetition. The circumstantial case is compelling only if you ignore the base rate. Young men died frequently in ancient Rome. Infection killed more soldiers than battle. Sudden illness struck without warning in an age before antibiotics or modern medicine. The average life expectancy was roughly 35 years, and even the wealthy and privileged died young with depressing regularity. When you consider how many young men in Augustus's extended family survived, how many potential heirs lived long, healthy lives and died of natural causes in old age, the deaths that occurred don't seem statistically improbable. They seem, tragically, normal for the era. Moreover, the motive attributed to Livia doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny. If her goal was to secure power for Tiberius, why would she have waited until her 50s and 60s to begin this murderous campaign? Why not eliminate rivals earlier, when she was younger and had more time to consolidate her son's position? Why allow Gaius and Lucius to be adopted by Augustus, to be elevated to positions of prominence, to build their own bases of support, only to kill them years later when the task would be more difficult and suspicious? The most powerful argument against the poisoning accusations is the simplest one. Livia didn't need to poison anyone. She had already won through patience and image. Augustus trusted her completely, consulted her on every major decision, valued her counsel above all other advisors. Her network of clients and allies was so extensive that she wielded influence throughout the empire without holding any official position. She had made herself indispensable to the functioning of the imperial system. Why risk everything, her reputation, her safety, her life, on a series of murders that could be discovered and would destroy everything she had built? What we do know with certainty is that every death, every exile, every downfall left one outcome increasingly inevitable. When Augustus finally looked for an heir, when age and attrition had narrowed his options, only Tiberius remained. Not the first choice, not the preferred choice, but the last choice standing. Tiberius had been forced to divorce his beloved wife Vipsania to marry the widowed Julia, Augustus's daughter. It was a political marriage, loveless and doomed. Julia, accustomed to younger, more charming husbands, reportedly despised Tiberius. Tiberius, who had loved Vipsania genuinely, was miserable in the match. When Julia was exiled for adultery, Tiberius felt neither vindication nor relief, only the weary recognition that his personal happiness had been sacrificed to dynastic politics and had produced nothing but scandal. He withdrew from public life, retiring to Rhodes in what modern psychologists might call a breakdown, but what Romans understood as voluntary exile. For years, while Augustus searched desperately for alternative heirs, Tiberius lived as a private citizen on a Greek island, studying philosophy and refusing to engage with imperial politics. It was an act of rebellion, passive but absolute, a statement that he would not compete for power he did not want. But fate, or Livia's patient influence, brought him back. When Gaius and Lucius died, when Agrippa Posthumus proved unsuitable for rule, when every other option had been exhausted, Augustus recalled Tiberius from Rhodes, not with enthusiasm, not with joy, but with grim necessity. The empire needed an heir. Tiberius was the only one left with the experience, the capability, the family connection to make succession possible. Yet even then, it was not affection but necessity that drove Augustus's decision. The ancient sources are unanimous on this point. Augustus disliked Tiberius. He found him cold, austere, joyless, everything that Augustus himself had learned to hide behind a public mask of warmth and accessibility. Tiberius was a competent general and administrator, but he lacked charisma, refused to play the political games that Augustus had mastered, maintained a stern reserve that Romans found off-putting. In private letters, Augustus complained about Tiberius's temperament, his lack of warmth, his inability to connect with people. In public, he praised Tiberius's virtues, while making clear that the succession was not about personal preference, but about duty. When Augustus finally adopted Tiberius as his son and heir in 4 CE, the ceremony was formal and cold, a legal transaction rather than a celebration. But Augustus trusted Livia. In the emperor's private heart, through decades of marriage and partnership, she had become the embodiment of Roman virtue, the proof that his regime was blessed by the gods and sanctioned by tradition. He trusted her judgment completely, consulted her on every major decision, valued her counsel as he valued no one else's. And that trust carried her son to the throne she could never claim for herself. This was Livia's ultimate triumph and her ultimate frustration. She had achieved what no woman in Roman history had done. She had made her bloodline the ruling bloodline, had ensured that her son would command the empire, had secured the continuation of her family's power for generations. Yet she had done so not through her own merit acknowledged, but through her husband's trust, through the mediation of male authority that Roman law and custom demanded. She could advise but not command. She could influence but not rule. She could shape the succession but could never be the successor. Every victory came wrapped in the constraint of her gender. Every achievement required the fiction that power remained male, even as she wielded it. And she did so not by overt rebellion, not by challenging the structures that constrained her, but by flawless adherence to everything Rome demanded a woman should be. She won by seeming not to want to win. She gained power by appearing to desire only to serve. She changed Rome by claiming to preserve it. The irony is profound. Livia's greatest strength, her ability to work within the system, to use traditional gender roles as camouflage for unprecedented influence, was also her greatest limitation. She could go no further than the mask allowed. She could be powerful only so long as she appeared powerless. The moment she openly claimed authority, the moment she dropped the pretense of the modest matron, the entire edifice of her influence would collapse. So she remained in the shadows, patient and calculating, watching as her son prepared to inherit an empire she had helped preserve. She had spent decades building toward this moment, eliminating rivals or watching as they eliminated themselves, maintaining her network of clients and allies, ensuring that when Augustus died, the transition would be smooth, and Tiberius's succession would seem inevitable rather than controversial. The succession itself, when it finally came in 14 CE, was a masterpiece of managed transition. Augustus died in Nola at a villa outside Rome, with Livia at his bedside. The exact circumstances of his death would later be questioned. Had Livia poisoned him too, speeding along the succession to ensure Tiberius inherited while still vigorous enough to rule effectively? But no contemporary source suggests foul play. He was 76 years old, had been ill for some time, and died peacefully surrounded by family. What happened in the hours and days immediately following his death reveals Livia's continued influence. The news was carefully controlled, announced only after certain arrangements had been made. Agrippa Posthumus, the last potential rival to Tiberius, was executed on his island prison, murdered by his guards in what was officially described as a precautionary measure, though who gave the order remains unclear. Letters were sent to provincial governors and military commanders, ensuring that the legions knew Tiberius was now their imperator before any alternative claims could be raised. When the Senate met to confirm the succession, they found not chaos but order. Tiberius was Augustus's adopted son and designated heir. He had the support of the Praetorian Guard, the loyalty of the legions, the endorsement of Augustus's will. The senators, who might have dreamed of restoring the Republic or choosing their own candidate, discovered that all decisions had already been made. They could confirm Tiberius or face civil war. They confirmed him. And through it all, Livia remained visible but officially powerless. She was the grieving widow, the devoted wife who had lost her husband of 52 years. She organized the funeral, ensured the proper religious observances, presented herself as the embodiment of wifely devotion. Yet, behind that facade, she was managing the transition, ensuring smooth succession, maintaining the stability of the regime she had spent a lifetime building. The succession of 14 CE was peaceful. There were no rival claimants, no military rebellions, no constitutional crisis. For the first time in Roman history, power transferred from one autocrat to another without violence. This alone was Livia's achievement, the creation of a system stable enough to survive its founder's death, the establishment of dynastic succession so firmly that it seemed natural rather than revolutionary. Part 5. The Augusta, ruling alone. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Rome wept, but the empire did not fall into chaos. The streets were orderly, the legions remained loyal, the provinces continued their business without interruption. That seamless transition, that remarkable stability in the face of constitutional uncertainty, was Livia's work. She had spent 52 years preparing for this moment, building the structures formal and informal that would allow power to transfer without violence. Augustus's will was read before the Senate, and it contained a surprise that must have shocked even those who thought they understood the imperial family's dynamics. The emperor adopted Livia into the Julian family, granting her the name Julia Augusta. No Roman woman had ever possessed such a legal status. She was now officially a Julian, linked by adoption to the divine Julius Caesar himself, carrying a name that meant something profound in Roman political culture. More than that, she was Augusta, a feminized version of Augustus's own title, the Sacred One, the Revered One. It was a title that existed in no law, that had no precedent, that created a constitutional position out of nothing. She was now something between human and divine, a co-ruler in all but name, the living embodiment of the Augustan settlement that had transformed Rome from republic to empire. The will did more. It left her a substantial portion of Augustus's estate, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in the empire. Wealth meant independence, meant the ability to maintain her network of clients without relying on Tiberius's goodwill. It left her properties throughout Italy and the provinces, giving her a physical presence in communities across the Roman world. And it commanded that she be honored with official sacrifices and prayers, integrating her into the civic religion itself. Tiberius was now emperor, but his mother held a position unprecedented in Roman history. She was the divine Augustus's widow and adopted daughter, the Augusta, the mother of the current emperor, the wealthiest and most influential woman Rome had ever known. And unlike every previous imperial transition, where the old regime's family typically disappeared from power, Livia remained at the center of everything. For the first time, she stepped into full view. The modest matron, who had spent decades hiding her influence behind a facade of traditional femininity, now held official status that made invisibility unnecessary. She was Augusta, and everyone knew what that meant. She was powerful. She was essential. She was to be treated with the same deference Romans gave to male members of the imperial family. Her son, Tiberius, was emperor, holding the imperium that commanded legions and governed provinces, possessing the tribunician power that made his person sacred and his legislation automatic. But his mother, serene, commanding, unyielding, refused retirement. Why would she? She had spent her entire adult life building toward this moment, constructing the informal empire of influence that made her indispensable. Augustus's death didn't diminish her power, it revealed it. She managed petitions that came to the imperial household, reading requests from governors and generals, from cities seeking tax relief and individuals seeking justice. These petitions were officially directed to Tiberius, but many petitioners understood that access to the emperor often required the approval of his mother. Getting Livia's support meant your case would be heard favorably. Ignoring her meant your petition might disappear into the bureaucratic void. She corresponded with governors throughout the empire, offering advice on administrative matters, suggesting appointments to provincial positions, interceding in disputes between cities or prominent individuals. These letters were unofficial, carried no legal weight, came from someone who held no governmental office, but they came from the Augusta, the emperor's mother, and governors who ignored them did so at risk to their careers. She preserved the rituals of the imperial cult, ensuring that the worship of the divine Augustus continued properly throughout the empire. this was more than religious duty. The imperial cult was political infrastructure, the mechanism by which provincial elites demonstrated loyalty to Rome, the system that integrated diverse populations into shared identity. By managing the cult, Livia managed the empire's ideological foundations. She received foreign embassies. When kings and ambassadors came to Rome seeking alliances or presenting grievances, they paid court not only to Tiberius, but to Livia. Ancient sources record that visiting rulers treated her with the same protocols they would a monarch, standing in her presence, presenting gifts, seeking her favor. This was remarkable in a society where women were legally subordinate, where female authority was supposed to be limited to the household. Yet here was a woman receiving foreign dignitaries as if she were herself a head of state. The historian Cassius Dio, writing 2 centuries later but drawn on contemporary sources, described Livia's position with a mixture of admiration and unease. She ruled the empire with Augustus while he lived, and after his death held sovereignty alone. That sovereignty alone is significant. The Greek word is monarchia, monarchy. Dio was saying bluntly that Livia ruled as a monarch, exercising powers that no woman should have held, maintaining authority that exceeded any formal title. But the partnership between mother and son, which should have been the culmination of Livia's lifelong ambition, began to fray almost immediately. Tiberius grew weary of living in his mother's shadow. He was 55 years old when he became emperor, a mature man with decades of military and administrative experience. Yet he was still introduced as Livia's son as often as Augustus's heir. The empire looked to him for decisions, but they looked to her for approval. She published Augustus's letters to her, displaying their correspondence in a manner that emphasized the late emperor's trust in her counsel. These letters, preserved, copied, circulated, served as proof of her authority, evidence that Augustus had consulted her on every major decision. They legitimized her continued involvement in governance, showing that the divine Augustus himself had treated her as a partner rather than merely a wife. But to Tiberius, they were a reminder that his mother had influenced his adoptive father in ways he could never fully know, that decisions he thought were Augustus's might have actually been Livia's. Her statues appeared everywhere, in Rome, in provincial cities, in military camps. Everywhere Tiberius looked, he saw representations of his mother. Often she was depicted alongside Augustus, the two of them presented as joint founders of the new order. Sometimes she appeared alone, honored by grateful communities she had helped through her patronage network. The visual landscape of the empire constantly reminded citizens that power was shared, that the imperial family included a woman whose authority rivaled the emperor's own. Her honors accumulated. Cities named after her, Colonia Julia Augusta, settlements throughout the empire that bore her name, priesthoods dedicated to her cult, anticipating the deification that would eventually come, public festivals celebrating her birthday, official prayers offered for her health and safety. Each honor was technically granted to her by Tiberius, was officially a gift from emperor to mother. But Tiberius understood that refusing these honors would have been impossible, would have been seen as disrespect for the divine Augustus's widow and adopted daughter. The resentment grew. Tiberius was not a man who enjoyed the theatrical aspects of rule, who could smile and wave while seething internally. He was constitutionally incapable of the kind of political performance that Augustus and Livia had mastered. His discomfort with his mother's omnipresence showed, and Romans noticed. The Senate, always sensitive to imperial moods, began to test the boundaries, proposing honors for Livia that Tiberius would have to either endorse or reject, forcing him to choose between filial piety and imperial authority. The sources record several confrontations. When the Senate proposed that Tiberius be called son of Julia Augusta in official documents, emphasizing his connection to his mother rather than his adoptive father, he refused sharply. He was the son of the divine Augustus, not of Livia, regardless of legal adoption. When the Senate suggested that Livia be granted the title Mother of the Fatherland, making her symbolically the mother of all Romans, he rejected it as excessive, as granting her status that belonged only to emperors themselves. Yet he couldn't entirely curtail her power without appearing ungrateful, without violating the fundamental Roman value of pietas, the reverence children owed their parents. He was trapped in a bind of his own mother's creation. She had made herself so essential to the imperial system, had so thoroughly integrated herself into the mythology of Augustan peace, that removing her from power would have destabilized the regime itself. So he did the only thing he could do. In 26 CE, 12 years into his reign, Tiberius left Rome. He withdrew to the island of Capri, officially for health reasons, unofficially to escape his mother's shadow. He would never return to the capital, governing the empire from his island retreat for the remaining 11 years of his life. It was an extraordinary solution to an impossible problem. The emperor fled his own mother, putting the width of Italy between himself and her influence. From Capri, he could issue orders and make decisions without Livia's immediate presence, without the constant awareness that she was watching, advising, managing the aspects of rule that he couldn't escape in Rome. But leaving Rome meant leaving Livia to govern informally from the capital. And this she did with the same efficiency and subtlety she had demonstrated for 6 decades. She managed the daily operations of the imperial household. She received petitions and forwarded them to Tiberius with her recommendations. She maintained her patronage network, dispensing favors and building loyalty. She preserved the rituals and ceremonies that legitimized imperial rule. She embodied continuity with Augustus's reign, reminding Romans that the peace and stability they enjoyed were products of the system she and Augustus had built together. Rome had an emperor, but the emperor had fled. In his absence, it had a mother, and the mother ruled. For nearly 15 years, from 26 CE until her death in 29 CE, Livia remained the visible face of imperial power in Rome, while Tiberius governed from Capri. It was an arrangement that satisfied no one. Tiberius resented his mother's continued prominence. Livia resented her son's withdrawal. Romans were confused by an emperor who refused to show himself, but it worked. The empire remained stable. The provinces were governed effectively. The legions stayed loyal. Livia, now in her 80s, maintained her physical presence and mental acuity to a remarkable degree. She still received visitors, still read and responded to correspondence, still managed her household with the same attention to detail she had demonstrated as a young bride. Age had not diminished her authority or her influence. If anything, her longevity enhanced both. She had outlived Augustus, outlived most of her contemporaries, become a living link to the empire's founding generation. She was the empire's moral compass, the living embodiment of Augustan ideology. When questions arose about proper behavior, about how a Roman should act, about what the divine Augustus would have wanted, Livia provided the answer. She had become, in her old age, something like an oracle. Not divine herself, not yet, but close enough to divinity that her words carried weight beyond any official authority. Her influence was quiet, maternal, invisible to those who didn't know how to look for it, and absolute. Tiberius might issue edicts from Capri, might command legions and appoint governors, might exercise the formal powers of the Principate. But Livia shaped how those decisions were received in Rome, managed the social and ceremonial aspects of rule that Tiberius disdained, maintained the networks of loyalty and obligation that made governance possible. She had achieved something unprecedented and unrepeatable. A woman in a society that granted women no formal political rights had become essential to the functioning of the state. Not through revolution, not through challenging the structures that constrained her, but through working within those structures so skillfully that she transcended them without appearing to violate them. Part 6. Legacy and Deification. In the year 29 CE, at the age of 86, Livia Drusilla, the girl who once fled through the woods with a child in her arms, the young bride who married Rome's master while pregnant with another man's child, the matron who spun wool and shaped emperors, died peacefully in her villa outside Rome. Her death was not unexpected. She had been in declining health, had gradually reduced her public appearances, had begun the process that all Romans understood as preparing for death, settling affairs, saying farewells, ensuring that her household would continue functioning without her. By Roman standards, she had lived an extraordinarily long life, had outlived almost everyone from her generation, had seen the Republic die and an empire be born and reach maturity. But the manner of her death's reception reveals everything about the tensions that had defined her final years. Tiberius, her son, the emperor who had fled to Capri to escape her shadow, refused to attend her funeral. He claimed illness, claimed the press of imperial business, claimed that his presence was needed on Capri to manage the empire. The real reason was simpler and more human. He could not bring himself to stand over his mother's body and perform the grief that Romans expected, while feeling primarily relief that her influence had finally ended. His absence was noted, was commented upon, was understood by everyone as a final statement about their relationship. Even in death, even at the moment when Roman custom demanded that a son honor his mother with every possible ceremony and display of filial devotion, Tiberius chose distance. It was a profound violation of pietas, the fundamental Roman value of family loyalty and respect. It was also profoundly honest. He would not pretend to mourn a woman whose omnipresence had defined and constrained his entire reign. Yet the city turned out in mourning anyway. Ordinary Romans who had lived their entire lives under the Augustan peace, who had known Livia as the First Lady for more than half a century, who had watched her transformation from young bride to divine matron, filled the streets for her funeral procession. They didn't need the emperor's participation to recognize what had been lost. They understood that an era had ended, that the last living connection to Augustus and the founding of the empire had been severed. The funeral was magnificent despite Tiberius's absence. The Senate voted honors, decreed official mourning, commissioned statues and monuments. Priests performed the traditional rites. Her body was cremated with the ceremony due to imperial family members. Her ashes placed in the mausoleum of Augustus beside her husband's remains. She was buried as Augusta, as the divine Augustus's widow, as the mother of the reigning emperor, buried with all the honors that Roman tradition could bestow. But Tiberius refused to deify her. This was the final, cruelest cut. Augustus had been declared a god immediately upon his death, had become Divus Augustus, worshipped throughout the empire in temples and festivals. Livia, who had been Augustus's partner for 52 years, who had been granted the title Augusta, who had been adopted into the Julian family, Livia was denied divinity. Tiberius, who possessed the authority to propose deification to the Senate, who could have elevated his mother to godhood with a simple request, refused. The official explanation was that she had expressed wishes against deification, that she preferred to remain merely mortal in memory. But everyone understood the real reason. Tiberius would not grant his mother in death the divine status she had already exercised in life. He would not allow her to become a goddess, to be worshipped, to have her influence extend beyond the grave through cult and ritual. It was petty. It was vindictive. It was also completely understandable from Tiberius's perspective. He had lived his entire adult life in his mother's shadow, had watched as she shaped policy and built empires, while he commanded legions and governed provinces. Even as emperor, he had never escaped her influence, had eventually fled Rome itself to gain distance from her omnipresence. In death, he could finally say no. He could finally limit her, constrain her, reduce her to merely mortal status. The effect was to damage his own reputation more than hers. Romans, who valued filial piety above almost every other virtue, were scandalized. To refuse your mother the honors she deserved, to deny her deification when she had been Augusta and the divine Augustus's widow, to skip her funeral and block her apotheosis. These actions marked Tiberius as ungrateful, as impious, as a bad son. It confirmed everything that Romans had suspected about his cold temperament and joyless character. And in her absence, the dynasty she had built began to unravel with terrifying speed. The family that had ruled through balance and restraint, through careful image management and political sophistication, gave birth to emperors of chaos and madness. Tiberius himself, alone on Capri without his mother's restraining influence, grew increasingly paranoid and cruel. The treason trials increased, the executions multiplied, the atmosphere of fear that Augustus and Livia had worked so hard to dispel returned to poison the empire. The wise old general became the paranoid recluse, the capable administrator became the tyrant, the last link to Augustus's regime became its negation. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, 8 years after his mother, power passed to his grandnephew Caligula. Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, descended through both Julian and Claudian lines, a young man who seemed initially to promise a return to the glory of Augustus's reign. Instead, he became synonymous with madness. The emperor who declared himself a living god, who appointed his horse to the Senate, who engaged in such spectacular cruelty and excess that Romans wondered if the dynasty itself had been cursed. Caligula was assassinated after 4 years. Power passed to his uncle Claudius, Livia's grandson, through her younger son Drusus. Claudius was a scholar, a historian, a man of genuine intellectual accomplishment, who had been excluded from power because of physical disabilities and a stammer that made him seem incompetent. He proved surprisingly effective as emperor, conquering Britain and reforming the bureaucracy. He also married Agrippina the Younger, Livia's great-granddaughter, who would allegedly poison him to place her own son on the throne. That son was Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the emperor who murdered his mother, who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, whose persecution of Christians made him a figure of apocalyptic evil in later tradition. Nero's reign ended in suicide and civil war in the year of the 4 emperors that nearly destroyed the empire, in chaos that made the civil wars of the Republic seem tame by comparison. In the span of 4 decades after Livia's death, the dynasty she had built fell apart. The careful balance she had maintained, the image management she had perfected, the subtle influence she had wielded to keep the imperial family functional, all of it disappeared. Without Livia's discipline, without her patient cultivation of virtue and restraint, without her ability to manage the dynasty's public perception and private dysfunction, the facade of peace buckled and collapsed. The Julio-Claudian emperors became bywords for tyranny, madness, and excess. Everything that Livia and Augustus had worked to build, the image of responsible rule, of emperors as servants of the state rather than masters of it, of power exercised with restraint and justified by results, was destroyed by their descendants. The dynasty survived in name until 68 CE, but it survived as a perversion of everything its founders had intended. Yet even in the chaos, even as the dynasty collapsed into madness and civil war, Livia's memory persisted. Years after Tiberius's death, after Caligula's assassination, during Claudius's reign, something remarkable happened. Claudius, her grandson, restored her name and formally deified her. In 42 CE, 13 years after her death, Livia Drusilla became Diva Augusta, the divine mother, the eternal matron, a goddess worshipped alongside her husband. It was a restoration of justice, a correction of Tiberius's petty vindictiveness, an acknowledgement of what everyone had known all along, that Livia had been essential to the empire's founding and stability, that she deserved the same divine honors granted to Augustus, that her legacy transcended her son's resentment. Diva Augusta, the divine Augusta. Her likeness appeared on coins throughout the empire, her profile stamped on the currency that flowed through every market and crossed every border. Temples were dedicated to her worship, priests appointed to maintain her cult, festivals established to celebrate her memory. She received the sacrifices and prayers that Romans offered to the gods, was invoked in oaths and ceremonies, became part of the official pantheon. She was no longer merely a woman, no longer merely the emperor's widow or mother. She was an idea. That stability, image, and restraint could rule empires as effectively as armies. That soft power could match hard power. That influence could equal authority. That a woman working within the constraints of a patriarchal system could transcend those constraints through intelligence and patience. Her deification made permanent what had always been temporary about her power: the dependence on relationships to men, the vulnerability to changes in imperial favor, the inability to pass authority to female descendants. As a goddess, she was eternal. As Diva Augusta, she could never be diminished or forgotten or reduced to footnotes. She had achieved immortality literally through cult and worship, and metaphorically through the establishment of a template for imperial women that would persist for centuries. Future empresses would study Livia's example, would adopt her strategies, would invoke her name as justification for their own influence. Women like Agrippina the Younger, like Plotina, like Julia Domna, women who wielded power without formal authority, who shaped emperors and dynasties through counsel and influence, who worked within systems that denied them recognition while achieving outcomes that any male politician would envy. The Roman Empire would last another 4 centuries in the West, another millennium in the East. The governmental structure that Augustus and Livia created would be copied by kingdoms and empires throughout European history, would influence the development of monarchical systems across the world, would provide the template for how autocracy could dress itself in the language of tradition and legitimacy. And through all of it, Livia's example persisted. Not openly, not obviously. Women's history operates in shadows, is passed down through whispers and implications rather than official records and public monuments. But the pattern she established, the methods she perfected, the strategies she developed for wielding power while maintaining the appearance of powerlessness, these became part of the political toolkit available to women in societies that officially excluded them from politics. Her story was rewritten by men who feared her, who could not accept that a woman might have been as capable and intelligent as any male statesman, who needed to believe that female power was inherently illegitimate and probably criminal. The poisoner legend was easier to accept than the truth, that Livia was a political genius who understood power better than almost anyone in Roman history, who innovated strategies that would be studied and copied for thousands of years, who built an empire of influence without ever holding office or commanding armies. But her true legacy endures in every political spouse who shapes policy from outside official positions, in every strategist who disguises strength as virtue and ambition as duty, in every woman who learns to speak the language of patriarchy fluently enough to bend it to her purposes. In a world that silenced women, Livia spoke. Not with words, but with survival, not with speeches, but with results, not through revolution, but through evolution. She proved that power need not roar to be absolute. She demonstrated that the most effective influence is often invisible, that the truest authority comes not from formal titles, but from being indispensable. She showed that in a system designed to exclude you, the path to power lies not in confronting the system directly, but in working within it so skillfully that you transcend it. She whispered her way into eternity, and 2,000 years later we're still listening, still trying to understand how a woman with no legal rights became the most powerful person in Rome, still debating whether she was monster or genius, villain or visionary. Perhaps the answer is that she was all of these things, that political brilliance cannot be separated from moral ambiguity, that the price of power is always compromise. What's certain is this. Livia Drusilla changed the world. She created the template for imperial dynasties, established the role of the Empress, proved that power could be inherited, and that women could exercise it even when law and custom said they could not. She built something that outlasted her life, that shaped the course of history, that made the Roman Empire possible in the form it took. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Livia is not what she achieved, but how she achieved it. Through patience and image, through virtue and calculation, through making herself indispensable while appearing merely traditional. She played a rigged game and won. She operated within constraints that should have been insurmountable and transcended them. She was denied official power and became unofficially more powerful than anyone in Rome. That is genius. That is legacy. That is why, 2 millennia after her death, we still tell her story, and why that story still has lessons for anyone who has ever faced a system designed to exclude them, who has ever needed to wield power without authority, who has ever had to whisper when they wanted to roar. Livia Drusilla, the girl who fled through the woods, became Diva Augusta, the divine mother of Rome. She was prey who became predator, refugee who became empress, silenced woman who shaped an empire. She was the genius hidden behind virtue, the revolution disguised as tradition, the whisper that changed the world. And her story is far from over.